In March of 536 AD, people across the Roman Empire woke to find the sun had dimmed to a pale disk. It wasn't darkness. The horizon was still visible, figures still cast faint outlines, but something fundamental had broken. The sun no longer produced heat. Shadows vanished at noon. The light itself had turned blue. And this wasn't local weather. From Constantinople to the Chinese provinces, observers who had never heard of each other recorded the same impossible phenomenon. For the next 18 months, humanity lived under a sky that no longer functioned. The cause would remain unknown for 14 centuries. Procopius, the principal historian for Emperor Justinian I, began keeping notes on the atmospheric changes in early 536. He described the sun as giving forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. He was documenting a measurable difference in solar radiation. The beams cast no proper shadows. Heat had separated from light. In Italy, the Roman statesman Cassiodorus sent letters to subordinates describing what he called a blue-colored sun. He noted that at midday, when shadows should be shortest and sharpest, they had disappeared entirely. His reports include temperature observations that violated seasonal norms. He wrote that they had experienced a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. The seasons had collapsed into a single cold blur. Syriac chronicles from the eastern provinces put a number on the duration. John of Ephesus recorded that the darkness lasted 18 months, with the sun shining only about 4 hours each day as a feeble shadow. This wasn't nightfall extending. It was the quality of daylight itself degrading. The phenomenon extended far beyond the Mediterranean. Chinese records from the Nanxi, the official history of the southern dynasties, describe yellow dust falling from the sky like snow in 536. In July and August, provinces that rarely saw frost reported snow accumulation. The chronicles state that the stars were lost from view, suggesting atmospheric interference so severe it obscured celestial objects even on clear nights. By harvest season, populations were consuming tree bark ground into powder. These four sources had no communication with each other. The Byzantine court didn't correspond with Sichuan, yet the observations align on specifics: blue coloration, absence of shadows, cold intrusion into summer months, and extended duration. Something global had occurred. For over a millennium, historians treated these accounts as unreliable. Medieval chroniclers were known for apocalyptic rhetoric. Some scholars suggested the reports described a solar eclipse misunderstood by observers. Others proposed comet impacts, or pandemic-induced collective delusion. The texts remained curiosities, dramatic but unverifiable. The answer came from ice. Glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica accumulate snowfall annually, trapping atmospheric particles in distinct layers. Each year of snowfall creates a ring, similar to tree growth, that preserves a chemical snapshot of the air. In 2015, a research team led by glaciologist Paul Majewski and historian Michael McCormick drilled cores from the Coleg and Effeti Glacier in the Swiss Alps and compared them to existing Greenland cores. The cores showed a massive spike in sulfate aerosols dated to early 536 AD. Sulfate concentration jumped by orders of magnitude compared to baseline levels. This signature is diagnostic of volcanic eruption. When volcanoes erupt with sufficient force, they inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it converts into sulfuric acid particles. These particles remain suspended for years because the stratosphere sits above the altitude where rain occurs. No precipitation washes them out. Tree rings confirm the impact. Dendrochronology studies of European oak and Siberian pine revealed growth rings for 536 that were almost invisible under magnification. Trees had attempted to grow, but produced nearly no cellulose. The summer of 536 registered as the coldest in a 2,300-year dataset. Temperature reconstructions based on ring density suggested a drop of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius across Europe, a shift large enough to collapse growing seasons. The ice cores also revealed a second spike in 540 AD, suggesting another major eruption 4 years later. Current evidence points to two separate events: an initial high-latitude eruption in 536, likely Icelandic, followed by a tropical eruption around 540, possibly Ilopango in El Salvador. The double injection kept the stratosphere saturated with aerosols for over a decade. The mechanism that cooled the planet isn't falling ash. Ash is heavy. It drops out of the atmosphere within days or weeks, affecting only the immediate area around the volcano. What blocks global sunlight for years is sulfur dioxide gas reaching the stratosphere. When sulfur dioxide rises above 10 kilometers in altitude, it reacts with water vapor to form sulfuric acid droplets. These droplets are microscopic, small enough to stay airborne indefinitely, but large enough to reflect visible light. They function as a planetary mirror. Sunlight that would normally strike the Earth's surface bounces back into space before it can warm the ground or ocean. This is the inverse of the greenhouse effect. Normally, greenhouse gases trap outgoing infrared radiation, warming the atmosphere. Stratospheric aerosols do the opposite. They reflect incoming solar radiation while allowing Earth's heat to escape. The planet cools from both ends. The 536 eruption injected enough sulfur to reduce solar radiation by an estimated 15 to 20% globally. Photosynthesis requires specific wavelengths of light and minimum temperature thresholds. Wheat and barley, the staple grains of the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, need approximately 120 days above 10 degrees Celsius to mature. In 536, temperatures dropped below that threshold for entire growing seasons. Crops sprouted but never ripened. Grain produced green shoots in spring, but the kernels remained soft and failed to harden. By late summer, fields that should have been golden with mature wheat were filled with rotting stalks. Grapes shriveled on vines. Wine production, critical not just for consumption, but for water sanitation, as diluted wine was safer than raw water, collapsed. The aerosol layer persisted because the 540 eruption replenished it. Just as atmospheric sulfate concentrations were beginning to decline, the second volcanic event injected a fresh load of sulfur dioxide. Survivors who thought conditions were improving in 538 or 539 faced a reset. The cooling extended for another 5 years. Bread provided 70 to 80% of daily calories in the Byzantine and Roman diet. There was no diversified food system to fall back on. When grain failed, the entire caloric foundation of urban civilization disappeared. Cassiodorus, serving in the Ostrogothic administration of Italy, issued orders to open emergency granaries. His letters describe fields where crops had failed to ripen through lack of sun. He noted that the wine had turned sour because the grapes lacked sugar content. Viticulture wasn't just about luxury consumption. Wine mixed with water was the primary safe drinking fluid across the Mediterranean. Grapes require specific heat accumulation during summer to convert starches into sugars. In 536, vines produced fruit that shriveled on the stem, never achieving the sugar concentration needed for fermentation. What wine was produced turned acidic within weeks. The failure cascaded beyond calories into basic sanitation. The interdependence of Roman logistics meant that when Egypt and North Africa, the traditional breadbaskets, also experienced crop failure, there were no external reserves. Justinian attempted to stabilize prices through imperial decree, fixing the cost of grain to prevent hoarding and speculation. The novels, imperial legal codes, from this period contain language prohibiting price gouging on essential commodities. But price controls are meaningless when there's no grain to purchase. Wealthy landowners who controlled granaries held on to reserves, waiting for prices to rise further, or reserving stocks for their own households and clients. The imperial government tried to organize emergency shipments from Egypt to Constantinople, but Egyptian harvests had also collapsed under the same dimmed sun. Tax revenues fell as the peasant base, the majority of taxpayers, died or abandoned land. Numismatic evidence from this period shows fluctuations in the weight of gold solidi and increased debasement of copper coinage. When agricultural output drops by half and trade collapses, the money supply becomes unmoored from actual goods. Copper coins contained progressively less metal. The gold standard wavered. Wealth in the form of precious metal couldn't buy food that didn't exist. In China, the agricultural crisis manifested differently, but with equal severity. Frost in July killed rice paddies in southern provinces. The Nanshe describes populations grinding pine bark into powder and mixing it with whatever grain reserves remained. This wasn't a culinary choice. Pine bark contains almost no nutritional value, but provides bulk that temporarily quiets hunger. The process involves stripping inner bark, drying it, and pulverizing it into a flour substitute. People mix this with small amounts of millet or rice to stretch reserves. Famine mortality is recorded across multiple provinces. Yellow dust, likely a combination of volcanic ash and loess soil disturbed by abnormal wind patterns, fell continuously, coating fields and contaminating water sources. Trade routes became impassable. Banditry surged as desperate populations turned to raiding. Merchant convoys required armed escorts, which increased costs and reduced profitability. Many routes were simply abandoned. Local violence replaced centralized order. The interconnected economy of the Roman Empire fragmented into isolated regions where survival depended entirely on what could be grown or scavenged within walking distance. The psychological toll was theological. Without meteorology or volcanology, the dimmed sun was interpretable only as divine action. Byzantine liturgies from the 500s and 30s and 500s and 40s reflect themes of sin, judgment, and apocalypse. In a pre-scientific worldview, when the sun stops working, it means God is angry, or the world is ending. There was no secular explanation available. Prayers focused on divine mercy and collective repentance, attempting to identify which sins had provoked cosmic punishment. In upland Sweden, archaeologists have mapped settlement patterns showing that approximately 75% of farms and villages were abandoned in the mid-6th century. The abandonment is datable through pottery styles and the termination of peat cutting in specific bogs. People didn't migrate to nearby valleys, they left entire regions empty. Concurrent with this depopulation is a spike in gold hoards. Over 400 gold hoards dated to the 530s through the 550s have been excavated across Scandinavia, far exceeding the number found in earlier or later periods. These hoards aren't hidden in walls or under floorboards. They're buried in open fields, often in conspicuous locations like hilltops or near sacred groves. The traditional interpretation was that these represented emergency caches hidden from raiders, but the distribution doesn't match invasion patterns, and many hoards were never retrieved despite being placed in memorable locations. Swedish archaeologist Bo Gresslund proposed an alternative. These were sacrifices. In a pre-Christian Scandinavian worldview, the gods maintained cosmic order. When that order broke, when the sun failed, offerings were required. Gold, which normally represented wealth and power, became worthless compared to sunlight and crops. If burying your gold might convince the gods to restore summer, it was a rational exchange. Norse mythology contains a narrative structure called Fimbulvetur, the mighty winter, described in the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda. Fimbulvetur consists of 3 consecutive winters with no intervening summers. It precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world, and is accompanied by social collapse, described as brothers will fight and kill each other, siblings will break kinship bonds. Gresslund argues that Fimbulvetur is a cultural memory of 536. The wolf swallowing the sun in Norse cosmology maps onto the volcanic dust blocking solar radiation. The multi-year winter matches the duration of the cooling event. The social breakdown, brothers fighting brothers, reflects the collapse of community structures under famine pressure. The Arthurian cycle, recorded centuries later in Britain, includes the motif of the wasteland, a kingdom where crops fail and the land becomes barren because the king is wounded. Some literary historians suggest this represents a folk memory of the 536 period, when the land itself seemed cursed. Gildas, a British monk writing in the mid-6th century, describes landscapes of ruin and civil conflict in terms that align chronologically with the cooling event. Mythology functions as a historical archive when populations lack written records. The stories preserve not the exact details, but the emotional and experiential truth. The sun disappeared, people starved, and the world felt like it was ending. 5 years after the sun dimmed, a new catastrophe emerged. In 541 AD, bubonic plague appeared in the port of Pelusium in Egypt. By 542, it had reached Constantinople. Procopius, still recording events, estimated 10,000 deaths per day at the epidemic's peak. Modern demographic analysis suggests 5,000 per day is more accurate, but even that rate implies total mortality in the hundreds of thousands within months. The connection between the volcanic cooling and the plague is indirect but mechanistic. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, is endemic in wild rodent populations in Central Asia and possibly East Africa. These rodents, gerbils in the Central Asian steppes, marmots in higher elevations, normally live in environments where they subsist on wild grasses and seeds. Their populations remain geographically isolated from human settlements under normal climate conditions. When the volcanic winter killed vegetation across these regions, wild rodent populations faced starvation. Grass production collapsed, seed reserves were depleted. The rodents migrated closer to human settlements, seeking food stored in granaries. This brought plague-carrying fleas into proximity with Rattus rattus, the black rat, which lived in close association with humans. Black rats nested in grain storage facilities, urban waste areas, and especially aboard merchant ships where grain was transported in bulk. The ships provided both food and shelter, making them ideal habitats. The bacterium jumped species from wild rodents to ship rats through flea vectors. Once established in the black rat population, Yersinia pestis traveled along trade routes. The Mediterranean economy, though damaged by famine, still maintained maritime grain shipments between Egypt, Constantinople, and other ports. Rats boarded ships in Egyptian harbors. During voyages that could last weeks, fleas fed on human crew members. When ships docked, infected rats disembarked into new port cities, establishing fresh plague reservoirs in each location. The disease spread to every port connected by commerce: Alexandria, Carthage, Rome, Constantinople, and Antioch. Crucially, the human population in 541 was already compromised. 6 years of malnutrition had weakened immune systems. Vitamin deficiencies from failed harvests meant that lymphatic responses, critical for surviving bubonic plague, were impaired. Bubonic plague kills by overwhelming the lymph nodes. The bacterium multiplies in lymphatic tissue until nodes swell into painful buboes and eventually rupture. A well-nourished immune system can sometimes contain the infection. A malnourished one cannot. A population that might have weathered the plague under normal conditions died at catastrophic rates because they had no physiological reserves. Constantinople, which may have held 500,000 people in 540, experienced scenes Procopius described as beyond his capacity to document. Bodies accumulated faster than burial crews could remove them. The city repurposed towers and fortifications as mass graves. Traditional funeral rites were abandoned. The tax base for Justinian's empire, already weakened by agricultural collapse, was gutted. Military recruitment became impossible when a third of the population was dead or dying. Plague mortality estimates for the Mediterranean basin range from 30 to 50%. The grand reconquest campaigns that Justinian had launched to retake the Western Roman territories, North Africa, Italy, southern Spain, stalled. Armies couldn't be provisioned or reinforced. Administrative structures collapsed as trained bureaucrats died without replacement. The plague wasn't caused by the volcano. Yersinia pestis existed before 536 and would cause later pandemics, including the Black Death of the 14th century. But the volcanic winter created the ecological and physiological conditions that allowed the bacterium to jump into human populations at a moment when those populations were least able to resist. The climate didn't recover in 545 or 550. Ice core data and tree ring evidence show that cooling persisted until approximately 660 AD, 125 years, known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. The duration wasn't purely volcanic. The 536 and 540 eruptions provided the initial forcing, but ocean thermal inertia extended the cooling. Oceans store vast amounts of heat and release it slowly. When stratospheric aerosols cool the atmosphere, the ocean surface also cools, but the deep ocean takes decades to equilibrate. Even after the aerosol layer dissipated in the late 540s, the cold ocean continued to suppress atmospheric temperatures. Surface waters that had cooled by several degrees continued circulating through deeper layers, preventing the rapid rebound that might otherwise have occurred. Additionally, smaller eruptions occurred throughout the 6th and 7th centuries. None matched the scale of 536 or 540, but they prevented full recovery. Each new injection of sulfate aerosols delayed the warming. The climate system never stabilized long enough to return to pre-536 conditions. Agricultural productivity remained suppressed for generations. European crop yields didn't return to pre-536 levels until well into the 7th century. The Mediterranean economy, which had been based on surplus grain supporting large urban populations and professional armies, could no longer sustain that model. Cities shrank. Urban populations that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands contracted to tens of thousands. The archaeological record shows abandonment of entire urban quarters, houses left empty, aqueducts falling into disrepair, public buildings repurposed or stripped for materials. The political structure of the late Roman world had depended on the taxation of agricultural surplus. Peasants paid taxes in grain and coin derived from selling grain. This revenue supported imperial administration, road maintenance, military salaries, and urban food subsidies. When surplus disappeared, centralized administration became financially impossible. Tax collectors couldn't extract revenue from populations that were dead or producing only subsistence-level crops. Imperial authority contracted to core regions that could still be directly controlled. Local strongmen and landowners filled the power vacuum, controlling smaller territories they could provision directly. This is the structural origin of medieval feudalism, not a cultural choice, but an economic necessity imposed by reduced carrying capacity. A lord with a fortified estate and surrounding farms could ensure his own survival and that of his immediate dependents. He couldn't support a distant emperor or contribute to empire-wide infrastructure. The system localized by necessity. Trade networks collapsed in tangible, archaeologically visible ways. North African red slip pottery, a mass-produced ceramic that had been traded across the entire Mediterranean for centuries, disappears from British and Northern European sites after the mid-6th century. Egyptian grain shipments to Constantinople, once routine and massive in scale, became irregular and then ceased. The bulk commodity trade that had allowed regions to specialize, grain from Egypt, olive oil from North Africa, wine from Gaul, metals from Spain, stopped functioning. Regions became self-sufficient because they had no choice. This fragmentation marks the end of the classical economic system. The Roman Empire in the West had already fractured politically by 476, but the Eastern Byzantine Empire had maintained Roman-style logistics and administration. The volcanic winter of 536, compounded by the plague, broke that system permanently. What emerged was a world of smaller, isolated economic units. Medieval manorialism, where a manor produced nearly everything it consumed and consumed nearly everything it produced, became the dominant model because long-distance exchange was no longer viable. The late antique Little Ice Age also had geopolitical effects beyond the former Roman world. Some environmental historians argue that the cooling altered rainfall patterns in the Arabian Peninsula. Ice core evidence suggests increased precipitation in the late 6th century, which would have expanded vegetation and improved conditions for pastoralists. This was followed by a severe drought in the early 7th century, potentially pushing Arab tribes outward in search of resources. Whether this climatic shift contributed to the rapid Arab conquests beginning in the 600s and 30s remains debated, but the timing is suggestive. The Middle Ages began not with the sack of Rome, but with a volcanic eruption that proved empires are only as resilient as their harvests. The year 536 AD revealed something about human civilization that remains true. Complexity requires stability. The Roman world was an extraordinary achievement of logistics, law, and urban life, but it operated on the assumption that summer would arrive, that grain would ripen, and that the sun would provide heat. When a volcano in Iceland injected sulfur into the stratosphere, that assumption broke. The empire didn't collapse immediately. It starved slowly, sickened, and fragmented over decades. The classical world ended not because it was conquered, but because the atmosphere changed, and 2 degrees of cooling was enough to dismantle 1,000 years of accumulated order.